No, I didn't copy. Sorry. Let's try again. Sorry, Mary.
No, you go.
Let's see. 1, 2, 3. Let's see if it worked this time. Yeah, now it did. All right. Let me start the recording is on. This is lesson 11, if I'm not mistaken, of Zero to Hero Dataverse. This time around, uh, you're gonna be we're gonna be hosting one of the greatest of when it comes to all things Dataverse, especially ALM. Well, I think the first lesson I saw on ALM was from you in Paris, if I'm not mistaken. I think you were there in the
I was, yeah.
365 Saturday.
That's right.
Yeah, it was great. And I mean, I may not speak from with a whole lot of authority here, but in terms of ALM in Azure DevOps pipelines, I think your material was the first one that I saw. Before that, it was just scripting, PowerShell, and such. So it's great to have you here. Thanks for dedicating your time to coach us today. Take it away.
You're welcome. Let me just share my screen. Give me a moment. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay. All right. Yeah. So very happy to be here today. Obviously, it's you know, been a journey with these sessions. Such great content in the last few sessions. So hopefully, you know, you'll find this session useful as well. So just, you know, before we start, just a few things about myself. So I'm Wael Hamze. I'm a business applications MVP. You've got some contact details here, YouTube channels, you know, blog, you know, LinkedIn. So feel free to connect. If you've got any questions after this session, I'll be happy to answer them. So, you know, as Victor mentioned, you know, I've been doing, you know, Dynamics and Power Platform since probably Microsoft Dynamics CRM version 1.2. So the platform has evolved a lot, you know, since then, and you know, as the ALM journey has evolved as well. So hopefully, you know, in today's session, I can show you, you know, some of the things, you know, you can do today with ALM, and you know, we've got 2 sessions on ALM. So so the kind of things I'll be covering is I will start with security, because I think security is important. You know, whether you're administering the Power Platform, whether you're creating pipelines and ALM processes, or whether you are a maker, it's good to be aware in terms of where to configure things, or be aware of the things that are configured in case you face any issues, or in case you want to reach out to somebody, you know, to make changes. So once we cover the security, then we can talk about ALM, and in the ALM space, I will do a little bit of introduction, and then talk about pipelines, and then possibly some more advanced things you can do with ALM. And then finally, we wrap it up, you know, with the COE toolkit, and you know, some of the things you can do, you know, that are not there in the, you know, administration center, or not there in some of the tooling. So I'll show you some of the more things you can do to kind of expand on that as well. So today the primary focus is going to be on security and ALM, and then we'll kind of move on to the advanced ALM things and, you know, COE in the next session. So let's start with security. So security, I mean, if you think from a Power Platform perspective, you've got the Azure tenant, and then you've got the Power Platform kind of sits within the Azure tenant. And then within the Power Platform kind of area, you've got environments, and then within the environments, you typically have the apps or the components, flows, you know, Power Virtual Agents, you know, and all the kind of things you can do with Power Platform. And Dataverse is also there for when you want to store and manage data. And we've also got connectors, obviously, which allows you to kind of, you know, leverage various systems, whether they're on premise or in the cloud or third party. Allows you kind of, you know, build end-to-end solutions that leverage all the kind of ecosystem around you. So when it comes to security, you know, we've got multiple layers. So we start with the tenant. So in tenant, you typically have something called the AD policies. So these are configured by the Azure administrators. What they typically do is they kind of govern from where you can access, the tenant, and that also will include Power Platform. So, for example, the typical policy is you can access, the platform when you're on the corporate network, but if you go, for example, on personal devices or outside the corporate network, then the access is normally blocked. There are some other policies and tools that you can do for mobile devices as well. So that's AD policies. And then we typically got some tenant level settings at the Power Platform level. So there are some settings you can set, which we'll walk through briefly as well. And then you can manage who's got access to the tenant as well. And we've got some features like tenant isolation that you can set up for the apps and flows. So these are the things you can manage at tenant level, and they apply to all the environments that are within the tenant. So once you then move on to the lower level, then you've got the Power Platform environments. So typically on the Power Platform environments as well, you've got access controls. So who can access the environment and what level of permission you get on the environment. And you've got environment settings as well, which you can configure to kind of tweak various features within that environment as well. Some of them may impact security, some of them not. And there is a feature here called encryption as well. So if you are using Dataverse, it is a feature that is not available out of the box, so it can be turned on request. So if you're storing data in Dataverse and you have requirements, whether you're working for a highly regulated environment, then you can have customer manage encryption keys enabled on Dataverse so that the data is encrypted, with your own keys, and that allows you to basically lock the environments or unlock the environments, depending on your needs. So that's again, it's something you can do on these Power Platform environments. So once we've got the access on the tenant and the environments, then the next level of permissions is on the components themselves. So you can set up security on the apps in terms of who can make changes to the app, who can view the apps, etc. And then we've also got another level of permissions on Dataverse. So on Dataverse, again, there are security roles in there, so you can configure your security exactly in terms of who can access the data and who can modify the data. And I think Rebecca did a very good session in this series on Dataverse security. So I'm not gonna go into too much details in this session. And finally, we got connectors. So if you're on your corporate network, for example, if you want to go out to the internet, there are proxies, there are DLP solutions. There's lots of things in place to kind of keep that environment secure. When it comes to connectors, your apps and flows run, in the Microsoft data centers. So your proxies and all these kind of things, they don't play a role in there. So for that reason, we've got something called the data policies, which basically allows you to configure what connectors you can use within your environment, and we'll take a look at that as well today. So this is at a high level in terms of all the security or some of the most kind of used security features that you have in Power Platform at a high level. So if you are a user coming into that, to use one of the apps, you have to go through all these layers, in terms of you have to be in the right place, you have to have the right roles on the environment, on the apps, etc., to be able to use them. So so that makes the kind of platform very secure. In addition to being able to do things very quickly on the platform, you've got a lot of features in there to make it secure as well. So let's talk about permission levels. So this is quite important. So in Azure, you typically have the global administrator. So the global administrator can do everything in Azure, but they can also do everything in Power Platform because Power Platform sits within the Azure tenants. So under that, you've got some special roles for Power Platform. So the two roles that are available are the Dynamics 365 administrator, which allows you to configure the Dynamics 365 functionality, and you've got the Power Platform administrator, which basically allows you to do everything you need to do in Power Platform. Now there is a slight difference between the two. So the Power Platform administrator basically gives you access, to all the settings and all the environments in the tenant. So once you have that role, you can access any environment, any data, within the Power Platform. With Dynamics 365 administrator, you can access only the environments in which you are a member of the security group that is linked to the environment. So, if there are 5 environments in the tenant and you're a member of the security group that gives you access to only the 3 environments, then you can only see this and manage these 3 environments, unless the environment obviously doesn't have a security group, in which case, the Dynamics 365 administrator will also be able to access it as well. So if you've got an environment, for example, and you see lots of users, in your Dataverse environment, and you wonder how did these users, show up in there, they're probably a member in terms of one of these 3 groups, and that's why they automatically, get created as users within that environment. And then we move into the environments. So on the environments, again, if you don't have any of the 3 roles at the top, in the environments, you can have, either an administrator or a maker. So if you're an administrator, you can manage, most of the things within that environment. If you're a maker, you get less permissions, but you're able to create, and configure apps, within that environment. So these are the kind of permissions tree at a high level. By the way, if you've got any questions, feel free to kind of interrupt me and, let me know if you've got any questions. I'll be happy to answer. Okay, so the 2 roles that we've spoken about, they can be configured in Azure Active Directory. So if you go into Azure Active Directory and you click on roles and administrators and you search for Dynamics, you can see the Dynamics 365 administrator and the Power Platform administrator. So in case you don't have these permissions and you want something done using these permissions, you can go into the Azure portal and click on one of these roles and see who's a member of these groups, and then you can reach out to them to discuss with them, your requirement in terms of making some of the tenant changes in case you don't have access to it. Okay, so moving on, once we kind of move from the kind of Azure permissions, then we go into the admin center. So most of the things you do with Power Platform today, you can manage them within the admin center. So if you go to admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com, you log into the admin center. Here you can create the environments, you can manage the environments, and you can look at some of the analytics and some of the settings in the tenant as well. So one of the first things we're going to cover is the tenant settings. So if you go in the admin center and you click, on the top right corner, there's a button for settings. There's as you can see, there's a highlighted Power Platform settings in there. So if you click on that, then you get displayed a number of options. So at the moment, you've got a small number of options here, I would say. There are more tenant settings. So what you can do in here is basically configure who can create sandbox and production environments, and also who can create trial environments. So depending on on the policy that you want within the organization, you can tweak these settings to your needs, and you can also turn on the tenant level analytics in there. So to be able to manage these settings, you need to be a Power Platform administrator, with the Azure role that we've spoken about. So what if you want to change more settings? So there is a PowerShell module, which is called the Power Apps Administration module. So you can get that from the PowerShell gallery. What it allows you to do, it allows you to do some of the functionality that you can do in the admin center, but using PowerShell, so you can start automating some of these things. But it also gives you access to some of the functionality that is not available in the admin center at this point in time, at least. So here is a list of some of the kind of main things you can do. Like you can manage environments, you can manage your flows and Canvas apps, you can manage connectors, and you can manage your data policies. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that you can manage your tenant settings as well. So if you go into your PowerShell command line, you can do get tenant settings, and then that will basically list you the current tenant settings that are available in the tenant. And what you want to be looking for here probably is what are the default settings that are currently in the tenant. So the default settings may work for you, but they may not be secure enough for your organization. So for example, portals creation is turned on by default, but you may want to disable that. Trial environments and things like that may be turned on as well by default. So depending on what you're trying to do, I would encourage you to kind of take a look at your current settings, see whether they kind of meet your requirements, and if not, then you can write a little bit of PowerShell script to update the tenant settings. So basically all you have to do is just create a request body, and then you set the properties in that you want to change based on the the previous screen. You decide which one of these you want to change, and you can add them to the request body, and then you can call the set tenant settings commandlet again, and that will update the tenant settings to the required values basically. Okay. So moving on, tenant isolation. So as you know, we've got connectors, and then connectors give you the ability to basically communicate with your on-premise data sources, third-party data sources, and some other data sources as part of Azure or Microsoft 365. So by default, if you create an app, basically your app can talk to any other tenant. So for example, if you create an app that links into SharePoint, you should be able to, by default, go into a SharePoint site that is outside of your tenant, unless obviously that SharePoint, the other tenant got some restrictions. But by default, your tenant can go out to any other tenant, and any other tenant can connect to your tenant, basically. So that's the default settings. So there is a feature in the admin center called tenant isolation. So once you turn that on, then it means your apps can't make any outgoing connections to other tenants, and then they can all, other tenants can't also come into your tenant. So let's imagine, again, why you would want to do this. For example, so by default, if you create an app, you can go into your corporate SharePoint site, but you can also go to your personal SharePoint site. So you could potentially read data from your corporate network and then upload it into your personal SharePoint site, which may be a security risk for your organization, or unless you got obviously valid use cases. So this is the kind of scenarios where you'd kind of consider turning tenant isolation on. Once it's on, connections are blocked by default, but then you've got the ability to configure. So if you've got a valid use case where certain application needs to connect to maybe another tenant that you manage, then you can whitelist the other tenant, and you can decide whether you want these to be incoming or outgoing. So the main thing to note is by default this is off, and then the tenant isolation doesn't apply to all the connectors. There's probably kind of over 600, 700 connectors by now. So the tenant isolation doesn't apply to all the connectors, only applies to connectors that use Azure AD based authentication. And at the moment is also in preview. So that's something also to bear in mind. So how do you set tenant isolation again? You go into the admin center, and there is a button here called on. Once you turn it on, then you can create rules, and then when you create rules, you can decide whether you want to allow incoming access or outgoing access, and then all you have to do is just provide a tenant ID of the tenant that either you want to connect to or you want to allow connectivity from. So that's tenant isolation basically. Any questions so far before we go into DLP?
I think we are good. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's continue. So let's talk about DLP. So DLP is quite important. It allows you to configure what connectors you can use within your apps and flows. So basically, you go into the admin center, and then you've got the ability to create a new policy. But again, by default, there is no DLP policy. So everything you can pretty much use all the connectors in all the environments. So once you configure the DLP policy, the first thing that you're going to get asked is the name. So I would normally recommend to have a naming convention when you're creating the DLP policies, because at some point you may have a lot of policies. So you want to make sure that the names are consistent so you can easily recognize them. So consider putting things like the environment type, the name, the project, the department, whatever you're trying to control with the DLP policy. So in terms of the scope, I'm going to jump straight into the scope. So there are different stages that you have to consider when you're creating the DLP policy. So, you have to decide on the name, the connectors, the environments. I'll cover scope first. So in general, if you're creating a DLP policy and you're a Power Platform administrator or a global administrator, then you can create. Then your policy is called a tenant policy. So basically, your policy is at the tenant level, and you have the ability to make it apply to all the environments. So you can either add it to all the environments, you can select the environments that you want it to apply to, or you can add it to all the environments, but also exclude some of the environments that you don't want that policy to apply into. So you got full flexibility. If you don't have these permissions and you're creating a policy, this policy will typically be an environment policy. So you can only apply it to the environments where you're a system administrator on. So if you're a system administrator in one of the Dataverse environments, you can create a policy for that specific environment. And as you can see, the steps are reduced in that policy. So the only thing you can really configure is the environments, and these will be the environments you've got access to and the connectors. But if you're at the tenant level, you've got a little bit more options, because you're kind of looking more widely now on the tenant, as opposed to kind of very specific requirements for a specific environment. So yeah, so as I said, tenant policies, Power Platform and global administrators, and then environment policies are created by the kind of local administrators. So the next thing is, once you decide on the scope, depending on the permissions that you have, then you need to decide on the connectors that you want to configure. So with DLP, the way it works is you got 3 categories. So you got business, non-business, and blocked. So blocked is self-explanatory. So if you put a connector in the blocked category, then that connector can't be used at all. If you put a connector in the business category, so if you got a flow, for example, basically, to make it slightly simpler, I think the business and the non-business are very similar, basically. So connectors within the business category can be used with each other. So if you've got an app that uses, for example, Office 365 users and Power Apps for makers, they're both in the business category in this case. So you can create a flow that uses both of them. But you wouldn't be able to create an app that uses Office 365 users and one of the connectors that is in the non-business category, because they belong into 2 different categories. So you may want to decide to put things in the non-business category, or to kind of split things, or you may decide actually to keep it simple. Maybe you just want to use one of these categories. Some connectors can't be blocked, so you can't actually put them to block. So for that reason, you may actually decide to put them in the non-business as opposed to business, where most of your data is. So that's another thing you want to consider. But basically, when you come here, you just have to kind of categorize your connectors into which categories you want. And there is one important feature on this screen, which is kind of set the default group. So when you set your kind of connectors and the policy, you're setting the policy for the connectors that are currently available in a tenant. But what happens when a new connector comes in? Where does that connector, which group does that connector go into? So you've got the ability to set into which group. So by default, it would go into the non-business group. So just be mindful, because if you create a policy, and today we have 600 connectors, and then in a month's time, let's say there is 650 connectors. So if you come back to the policy, in a month's time, you'll find that actually 50 connectors in the non-business category, which is maybe it's something you want, or maybe it's something you don't want. So you may want to consider to changing that default category into blocked, for example, and then you review them manually and then make a decision in terms of whether you want them allowed or not. So at the moment, there are 18 non-blockable connectors. They're basically, most of them are to do with Microsoft 365 functionalities. And then, if you've got more than one policy, basically the most restrictive policy takes precedence. So if you've blocked a connector in one policy, and then you create another policy for the same environment, then obviously the connector will be blocked. And then, in terms of policies, they're enforced at design time and runtime. So if you're trying to create a flow, it will let you know. If you're trying to run a flow, it will let you know as well. It will fail basically. Any questions on that, actually?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. So let's talk about, sorry. Let's talk about the, sorry, my screen is frozen. Yeah. Let's talk about some more DLP controls. So imagine where you want to allow a connector, but you don't want to allow all the functionality of that connector. So for example, I've got here the Twitter connector. So you may want to analyze tweets, but you may consider posting a tweet to be, a security concern. So there are some features you can apply on some connectors called the action controls. So in this case, you can configure this Twitter connector. You can decide what actions of that connector you want to allow. And you can also decide what to do with some of the new actions that will come in as the connector evolves. So that again is another feature that gives you the ability to kind of use connectors that maybe that you would normally wouldn't, but with these controls, maybe you can tweak them to work for you for certain use cases. And the other feature as well is called endpoint configuration as well. So the first one works on the actions. The second one works on the kind of endpoint filtering like URLs. So if you want to use the HTTP connector, typically you could access any HTTP URL. But with this connector, you can actually say that actually I want to allow access to a specific URL, but I want to deny access to all the other kind of URLs as a star. So that again gives you some granular control over what specifically you want the connector to be doing. So for example, with the HTTP connector, you could limit it to your internal URLs. Some other connectors, you may decide whether you want them read only or read write. So again, that gives you a little bit more flexibility and can make your, the end-to-end environment more secure as well. Again, these are turned off by default, so you'd have to turn them on to make it work. And finally, in terms of custom connectors, so if you've got custom connectors, again, you can now set some policies at the tenant level. So you can define your URL patterns at the tenant level. By default, the policy is set to ignore. So that means, the policy will ignore any custom connectors, which it will allow the custom connectors and let another policy decide on it. But you can obviously, deny, all the URLs and then allow specific URLs. And you can set the kind of different business groups, the categories in here as well. So you've got that flexibility as well. Now, if you're creating a policy for your kind of specific environment, so what you could do is actually you could configure it as part of the connectors as opposed to doing something in here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about DLP strategy. So how many policies do you need? So I think by default, you would need probably a policy for your default environment because that environment is available to everyone. And then once you set the policy for the default environment, then you want to start to probably think about other environments. So typically you would have a standard policy which applies to all the environments, and that's your standard configuration. And then after that, you can set some very specific policies. So you can have a policy per department, you can have a policy per region, you can have a policy per project, and obviously you could have a policy for your COE tooling because your COE tooling is very unique. So you can allow certain connectors to kind of manage the tenant and pull the data from the tenant. So in general, I think a policy for the default environment is obviously good. Some standard policies are good, and then you can try and create very specific policies for kind of very specific needs. So you probably would exclude these environments from the default policies and then apply very specific policies. But you could also kind of have two policies working in parallel as well if you want. So that's all about security. Let's see if we've got any questions before we move into ALM and DevOps.
I don't see any hands raised, but I got a quick question on policies. Based on what you described, are there templates that people can refer to when setting up these policies, or they have to decide what they want, are there guidelines, much like I know I may be pushing you to COE maybe, but yeah.
No, I haven't seen any kind of specific templates as such. They may be out there, but I haven't seen them personally. There is lots of guidance in the docs, in the Microsoft docs, in terms of how to configure your policies. But in general, I think the policies will be, very specific to the organization and the type of industry as well. So some organizations would have very light policies that would be kind of more open and encourage innovation, and there would probably be less concern around risk. And in some organizations where it's kind of highly regulated, security is important, they'll be more restrictive. And then if somebody's got a specific requirement, then they would kind of have a dedicated environment for that requirement, and there'll be a dedicated policy for that environment, just to make sure that things are kept under control.
I see.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on to ALM. Okay, so ALM and DevOps. So let's talk a little bit about DevOps. So I'll do a little bit of an introduction, and then I'll talk a little bit about pipelines, and then we'll see if there are any questions in the end. But in general, I think DevOps is the process in which you kind of turn ideas into something that the end user can use, and then all the stages that you go through in the middle is basically part of the DevOps process. So you start with your requirements. Obviously, it's important to get the requirements right. Then you kind of move into development. So this is the makers, building the apps, configuring things. Typically, you may have some peer reviews, depending on the size of the team. Some other person may want to review the work. Then you have a CI build, which automates the build of your apps and flows, basically generates solutions. And then we typically deploy that solution into a number of environments to take that solution through the different testing stages. So after you deploy it, you can run different types of tests, and then we release that final solution into production. And there is some change management processes probably around it. And then we monitor how the solution is behaving in the production environment. That's could be feedback from users, could be some application insights monitoring or some analytics, and then all of that basically generates feedback and goes back into requirements to improve the product going forward. So there are some high-level principles that we follow on DevOps. So fast flow. So from dev to production, needs to be very quick. It's very quick to create things with the Power Platform. So we want our DevOps and ALM processes to play well with that. We don't want to have processes that slow us down. We want to move things. We want to move, requirements in small batches. So we don't want to kind of have releases every 6 months. We want to ideally release, as frequently as we can, weekly or every few days or every 2 weeks, whatever is suitable for the team and the project. We want to automate as much as possible where it makes sense. Obviously, sometimes you have to do, cost benefit assessment and decide, how much you want to automate and how much is the effort versus how much you're gonna kind of, how much you're gonna leverage that value going down the line. You want to minimize the handoffs, which means basically making sure that the next person in the queue has got everything they need, reducing the number of teams that something has to go through. So if you're in a big organization, for example, the less decisions you have to do, the more streamlined the process is, the more quickly your pipeline is going to be. And that is part of kind of communication, collaboration. These need to be in place, in DevOps. And we're going to try and do things as early as possible. So if we're testing, we're going to shift left, so do testing as early as possible. So, doing checks on the solutions, doing automated tests, deploying things early into UAT, giving users, early feedback or every overview of the functionality, getting early feedback. And the feedback needs to be fast as well. So if we deploy into UAT, we want to take that input quickly, adjust the system, etc. So all of these, play nicely into the DevOps principles, basically, and the features. Okay, so Power Platform development. So we've got Power Platform development is slightly different actually than the typical development if you're used to kind of building .NET applications. So everything is typically checked into source control. You've got some nice merge facilities, and it's easy to compile and then deploy. When you're working with Power Platform, you kind of have different personas and different ways of doing things. So we have citizen developers, creating apps, potentially adding them to the solution, creating flows and all these kind of low code, no code capabilities. Sometimes we also require pro devs, so they probably typically work in Visual Studio, creating plugins, web resources, PCF controls, all these kind of things. And then this is actually quite powerful because you get a fusion team that kind of leverages the business knowledge, but also the kind of pro dev capabilities to kind of build end-to-end solutions that are low code, no code, but can leverage some of the coding capabilities if needed for integrations and extensions. So the ALM process, basically, once we set it up, it needs to cover all these personas and all of these different scenarios. So we'll see in today's session and the next session how we can achieve some of these things. So so what tools do we use? I mean, sometimes we get asked the question, do I use the tools that I normally use when I do other applications like JavaScript and .NET, or are there any specific tools that I want to use when I do Power Platform? So I kind of split the different capabilities in here. So from a backlog management, what I see most projects use is Azure DevOps or Jira. So these are the typical tools you would normally use anyway when building any kind of system. And then from a development perspective, you obviously build the apps in the Maker portal. But when we go to the advanced ALM, you want to make sure that these are available in version control. So things like Azure repos or GitHub can be used in here. And then when it comes to automation, we want to then take things from version control from our environments and deploy it into the other environments. So we can use things like Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, Jenkins, or any other kind of CI/CD pipeline can be used. And then once we deploy, we want to do testing. So Azure test plans can be used. We can use some Jira to kind of track test cases and things like that. And then for deployment and monitoring, ServiceNow is used for kind of managing the change management processes typically, but also things like Azure Monitor can be used to monitor some of the apps and Dataverse. These are just examples of tools. They're not a full list of things, but these are the kind of tools you would typically work with if you're working in an end-to-end DevOps process that kind of covers all of these different aspects. In some projects, you may be kind of less on testing, maybe less on monitoring, depending on how long the project is. But these features are available to you to leverage depending on the complexity of the project. So when it comes to creating pipelines, let's talk about some of the tooling that is available to us. So at the bottom layer, we've got the platform. So if you don't use any other tools, you've got things like the Dataverse web APIs available for you. So you can call these APIs to create solutions and to import solutions, export solutions. All this kind of stuff is available via APIs, but that is kind of fairly low level. So the next layer up, is some automation tools that come as part of the SDK. So things like the Power Apps CLI or some of the PowerShell modules, these give you some abstraction on top of the platform. So they allow you to kind of cover some of the common use cases that you would need in automation, like importing a solution could be, one of the use cases. And then on top of that, then we've got some either further abstractions. So these are things like, the extensions we get for the pipelines. So they may use all of these kind of tools in the lower layers, but they typically, gives you a very easy to use functionality. So again, it's another layer of abstraction that, improves your productivity even further. And then there is, we're starting to see even another layer on top as well. So these are kind of first class experiences. So for people who are not familiar, maybe with things like, pipelines and build tools, they want something very simple to use. So maybe they're working in Teams, they want something there in Teams to use, or they want an app that kind of abstracts all of these things for them. So we'll take a look at ALM Accelerator at some point later in the sessions as well to kind of show you how that looks like. But basically, typically, if you kind of use something from the top layer, then your time to market is fairly quick because you're using something that kind of implements very specific use cases, and it does all the work for you, in some cases. However, you kind of lose some of that flexibility. So that if you want a lot more flexibility, then you kind of start going down the layers as well. So again, it's that balance that you have to strike between time to market, flexibility, and then the other thing that I wanted to mention is for citizen developers, it's probably makes sense to kind of leverage some of the tools in the upper layers like the ALM accelerator and even maybe some of the pipelines in some cases. Whereas pro devs, they would typically be more familiar with some of the tooling in the lower layers. So the options are out there, I suppose. So depending on your requirements, if you got a good match for what something in the upper layers gives you, then that gives you the ability to get set up very quickly and meet your requirements quite quickly. If then you find some edge cases where you need to do something that is not available, then you can start to maybe augment that with some of the tooling in the lower layers as well. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, let's move on. Okay. So let's talk about the kind of very simple scenario today from an ALM perspective. So imagine we've got a requirement, we've got a solution, and we want to deploy that into another environment. So this is the kind of simple flow that if you're just starting out with ALM or with Power Platform, or if you're a very small team and your requirements are fairly simple, then this is something you could consider. So typically we've got one dev environment, and then you start configuring your components in that solution. Once you're ready to deploy, then you can potentially up the version and then deploy it into the test environment. You do some testing in there, you find out things are not quite right. So again, you up the version, you do another deployment. Once you're happy with things in your test environment, then you deploy that version into your production environment. Now, over time, that solution will obviously evolve. So then you go into version 2, and then you deploy that all the way across. So basically, you have one solution, you keep most of your requirements in there, and then you up the version, and then you push all the solution across all the different environments. You may have more than one solution, but in general, the flow is you move the whole solution across all the different environments. So how does the pipeline look for that? So again, you configure your changes in the dev environment. You would have a build. The build will basically update the version in the dev environment, export the solution, and will store it in an artifact repository. So an artifact repository is just a safe place for that solution to be stored that can be then used for deployments. So then at some point, someone triggers the deployment, either automated or manual. Then the release automation will take the artifact from the artifact repository and then deploy it into the QA or SIT environment. And then, when you want to deploy to production, you've got another person kind of approving that change, and then it goes into production. Basically, very simple. You export, you store, import, and then deploy to as many environments as you need. So some of the points I wanted to mention about the setup. It's quite easy to set up. It's simple to use and follow. But there are a number of things you need to be mindful of. So because you're working in one solution, especially if there is more than one person working in that solution, they may be working on different things. So it's difficult to decide, when do you export the solution? Is everyone ready? So you kind of have to agree a point when everyone is ready before you move that solution across, because otherwise you can kind of end up with some of the changes that are still in progress. So you kind of need to coordinate. If it's a small team, that can work. And obviously, we're just exporting solutions. We're not using version control in here, so you've not got full traceability. We've got a big dependency on that dev environment. So if something goes wrong with that dev environment, somebody does a change that kind of potentially breaking, then can potentially block all the people in that team in terms of doing their work in that environment. So just at a high level, again, the build process. So if we're creating a build, then we typically have our source, which is our dev environment or our version control. We then move into build. We handle things like versions, exports, generating the packages, our solution in this case. And then, we store. The output of the build is basically, your solutions and anything you want to be available for deployment. And sometimes you can include the tests as well, because the tests you may want to kind of execute on a number of different environments as well. Okay, so release process is, again, taking the artifacts and then deploying them into your different environments. So again, there's a number of different steps that you have to follow in there. So the kind of things that you could consider is things like approvals. Who needs to approve a deployment to a specific environment? Then you may want to consider things like backups and restores. Do you want to backup before you import in case you need to roll back? Do you want to import data? Do you have any additional steps? So in the next session, we'll take a look at some of the things you can do, like connection references, environment variables, and all these kind of things that you need to worry about when you do your deployments as well. So before we move into the demo, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the solution import process. So when you're importing solutions, there are different ways in which you can import a solution, and it can get confusing at times. So these are the options on the screen. So the simplest option is an update. So with the update is a single phase process. It's very fast because it only kind of works on the deltas, so it doesn't process the whole solution. And there's been a lot of optimizations going into that process as well. The only downside is it doesn't do deletes. So if you have an attribute in production and then in the dev environment you delete it because it's no longer required, and you import the solution using update, that the attribute will remain in production, which is maybe what you want, but over time, obviously you'll end up with lots of unwanted things in your production environment. So you just bear that in mind when you import your solution in the update mode. The other kind of process is the stage for upgrade. So this is kind of a two-phase process where you import your new solution, but the old solution remains in the environment. So for example, if you've got a field, if you got an old field and you create a new field and you want to migrate data from the old field into the new field, you can deploy the solution in an upgrade mode. So the new field becomes available, you do your data migration, and then once you do the data migration, then you apply the upgrade, which means then the old solution and the old attributes are no longer part of the new solution will get deleted. So again, that's a two-stage process. It's only available for very specific scenarios like data migration. Obviously, it's slower. And then finally, the upgrade is kind of, it does the second one, but in one process, so you don't have to worry about splitting up into two different processes. So it kind of does everything for you, but in one single transaction. So these are the kind of processes at a high level. So So for today's demo, I'm going to be talking about the Power Platform build tools. So this is a tool that is provided as part of the SDK. It's been available since July 2019. And it's got lots of tasks basically that allow you to do all the things that you would want when you do your ALM processes. So the kind of standard tasks that you would need when you create an automated process, whether to import, export, check your solutions. These are available as part of this tool, so you can use them to configure your ALM processes. Okay, so I am gonna just give you a quick demo before we wrap up the call for today. So let me share my other screen.
Hey, well, just a quick comment on those uh, import types or export types for that matter. The update one doesn't delete the fields. And one scenario that we see, especially at the beginning of projects, is where someone defined a column and then after talking with a customer, they realized that it was the wrong data type, and then now they want to recreate, right? If you were used to use the update scenario to deploy that solution to another environment as a managed solution, then the previous column would still be there with the wrong data type. And then when you try to export again, you get a bunch of errors because you're trying to replace or to create a column that already exists with a different data type. So that is something to keep in mind. And one question that I had with that staged approach, the upgrade apply, is it possible to do upgrade apply even if you are swapping the column name or column type?
That's a very good question. In general, I would say no, because that's sometimes someone, you're right, I think it's a valid scenario where someone creates a column as a string, and then they decide to actually it's not a string, it's an integer or something, and then they end up that they've already deployed the solution into UAT, and then what they end up doing is actually changing, removing that field and creating a new field with the same name in the dev environment, and then trying to deploy it into UAT, and then two fields can't exist in the same environment with the same name but different types. So hence why that deployment would fail. So the way I would normally work around it is remove the field, take an export of the solution and then deploy it into UAT. That will delete the field, and then create the field with the same name but a different type. Yeah, it
Copy.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about it because you suggested that the upgrade and apply would give you that window for data migration, right? But they both cannot exist at the same time, so therefore you can't really do. And I think the validation takes precedence over even the completion. So yeah. All right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I've been there a few times myself. Okay, so let's have a demo of the pipelines. So I've got a solution here called the XRM CI sample. So it's in a dev environment. So let's assume we want to, export that solution and then deploy into a different environment. So one of the first things you have to do is you have to basically install the Power Platform build tools extension. So basically you go to the marketplace, if you're using Azure DevOps, and then you search for Power Platform, and then there'll be different types of tools. So this is the one I'm going to be using today. So you just install it, and then once you install it, basically you need to connect into your Dataverse environment. So once you install it, you'll see a number of different connections becoming available. So if you keep scrolling, there's a Power Platform connection. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to create one of them. So the way to do it is you basically specify your Dataverse URL, your tenant ID, and then what you need to do is you need to create something called the application registration. So there are some documentation in the docs in terms of how to do that. I won't go into too much detail, but basically, because this is a DevOps pipeline, it will run. You don't want it to be running under a user. So you want it to run as an application from a system to system integration perspective. So once you create the application, you get like the ID and the secret, and then you can add them in here and then give that a name. So you can see, in my case, I've already got a few created. So we've got one for dev and one for prod. So in terms of the pipeline, I'll show you one simple pipeline today. So one of the first things you have to do at the moment is you need to start adding tasks, which you can do, easily from here. You can just, search, for example, tool installer, and then it will show you the tasks. So you can just quickly add them into the pipeline. So this is a pipeline that is built using the user interface. Azure DevOps supports YAML pipelines as well, which we can show you in the next session. But for this demo, I'm just gonna kind of keep it simple. So the first task that you add is the tool installer. What this does is basically, gets all the tools that are required to execute some of the other tasks in the process. So next step is we want to update the version of the solution. So the first thing you have to do is select the connection. So I've selected the connection that was created, and then I want to give it the solution name. So instead of having to repeat the solution name over and over again in the pipeline, what I sometimes do is I use something called the variables. So I create a solution name variable called the solution name that we just looked at previously, and then what I do after that is I just use it in here, and then it's basically in the next step I can use it as well. So I don't have to if I change my solution name, I don't have to go through every single step in here. And then you need to give the solution the version number. In this case, I've used the build version. So if you go into the the options, you can set the version number of your build. So you want to make sure that that follows the kind of CRM solution naming convention, which is like the standard kind of build format convention. So if we go back in here, so I've set the version, I've said this is the solution, set the version to the build number, and then after that export the solution. So again, you need to decide what environments you want to export the solution from, what's the solution name, and then you basically need to decide, where do you store the solution. In this case, every build agent will have a special directory that you can use it to store temporary files. So you just need to kind of decide what the file name is going to be. So in this case, I just use the solution name and I'm exporting a managed solution. So I'm just gonna do as managed. And then make sure you just take the export asynchronous, because that kind of prevents some of the issues you have if you've got proxies or other things, because things will time out in some cases. And then from an export perspective, there are a number of options here that you can choose. So depending, by default, it will just export the solution, what you've added to the solution, but you may want to export the auto number settings, for example. If you're not sure what auto number settings is, you go to the docs, you go to the solution export class, and then you look at properties. You click on auto number, and it will tell you exactly, what fields or settings are getting exported as part of that. So if you've set something like that in the dev environment and you want that moved over to your test environment, just take a look at these and then decide which ones you need. Yeah, so basically, once we run this pipeline, if we go back again, yeah, so once you run this pipeline, it will basically create something called the artifact. Sorry, let's just go here. Yeah, so once you run the pipeline, let's just take a quick look at what happens. Yeah, basically you got the solution artifact published in here. So that's the solution we're gonna deploy, into the other environments. And then we've got something called the release process. Again, I'll edit the release process just to show you. So you select your build. So that's the build that we've just did. And then, similar, we need to add the tool installer task, and then we need to add the import solution task. So with the import solution task, you just browse to the build that I've just shown you, and then you select the solution. And then you've got some other settings which we can talk about in the next session. And then again, you've got some other settings, and the main thing to kind of note in here is the activate processes. So if you've got plugins or flows, you want them to be active, just take this one. So we'll try and activate all the processes, in your solution, provided, there isn't any settings that are missing. If you want to do that stage for upgrade, you need to add the holding solution. So that will kind of do your stage. And then if you want to do the upgrade, then there's another task called apply, I think, which basically does apply the solution after that. You see, you can apply the solution. So if you want to do a stage for upgrade, basically you have to do it in 2 phases. So you tick that one, and then you do the apply, and then again you need to put your solution name in here, and then that does your stage for upgrade. So yeah, that's a very kind of simple pipeline, export and import. You can go to your releases, see what's happening, in the logs. In general, hopefully things will work fine, but I've got an example here where I kind of tried to make it fail, so that if something fails, you go into the logs, and then you can see what the issue is. So in this case, I'm missing some dependencies in the environment because I haven't deployed some of the dynamic solutions, and my solution requires some of the dynamics capabilities. So yeah, so that's the import process. Quite straightforward. I've run out slightly over time, so just wanted to check whether you got any final questions.
I think it's pretty straightforward. I think it's really good. And one of the areas that I was glad you see you explain was more of the theory around DLPs and everything. So that was really good. Some of the things I don't usually play with, and we just use the environments that customers make available. But it was nice to see how to use them and how to configure. Appreciate it. Anybody else wants to ask a question? Just unmute your mic. If you want to be on camera, you can be on camera as well.
DLPs are just a growing nightmare with the way the Teams is configured and everything's open. So it's going to be fun, more fun every day.
Yeah, it is one of the things that I mean, at least in my calls with Microsoft, I talk a lot about is, and I echo your sentiment there, David. We see a lot of complaints, especially from folks managing the environments on the strategy from Microsoft of empowering makers. I mean, I'm all for makers, but then when you leave the door open for people to create whatever they want in the environments without teaching them the basics of ALM, what is a solution? Why should I create my components in a solution? Why should I create it in a lower lane environment and then potentially get approval to move it up the chain? Those things, they add a lot of complexity to what we do, and cleaning up is not fun. So it's nice that it's here.
Lotus Notes on steroids.
Say that again, sorry.
It's Lotus Notes on steroids.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is challenging in some scenarios in terms of how to manage that. So I think the DLPs is one way to do it. There is some other tools in the COE and some other features that potentially are coming as well, in the future that will help to manage the situation a little bit better. And if there's any specific things, I mean, I've got kind of an agenda for the next session, but if there's any specific areas that you would like me to kind of cover, let me know, because ALM is quite broad, so I'm trying to cover as many things as possible. But if there is any specific or challenges that you're facing, then let me know as well. I'll try and include that.
No, I think this walkthrough is great. I mean, what are you doing here at the end? You pretty much talk the talk, and now you're showing the walk. How to set up, how this is all plays out, and how we can automate. A lot of folks that I talk to, they say, I wanted to use ALM tools from Power for Power Platform, but I don't know how to get started. So this step by step is really good.
Yeah, it's quite straightforward. Yeah. in general, once you kind of create a pipeline, it takes a few runs to get it right. But it always obviously helps if you've got some step-by-step instructions, because it kind of will cover some of the things that you would normally miss, and then you get an error, and then you would have to run it again. And with pipelines, it's time consuming, because it's not like a simple, when you're writing code, you can quickly debug it. You have to run the build and the release again, and then it's time consuming. So I guess the more things you know up front, the more time you can save.
People don't usually go home after they're in the office telling their spouses that they have created 2 or 3 pipelines, right?
Yeah.
It would be different with an app. Hey, honey, I just got this app done. Not with a pipeline. Maybe I don't know. I may be wrong. Batten, do you want to add anything to the discussion?
Yeah. You showed the pipeline that you export the solution always from the CRM, not from the environment.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm a fan of having the solutions in the repository,
Yeah.
So as a source code. And in the step by Microsoft, when you pack the solution, you cannot use the mapping file.
Yep.
The XML. In yours, you can use it. Just one detail.
Yes, it's there. Yeah. It's included in some of the tools that I created. Yeah. But actually, in the next session, I'll show some of that version control stuff. It will be interesting for people to see how you can do it in version control as well.
Awesome. Well, we are about 10 minutes past, but it's well worth our time. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks to everyone who connected, and we'll see you next week.
No worries. Welcome. Take care. Bye.
Everyone. Thank you.